Imagine a place where East met West, where scholars gathered, amazing innovations happened, and cultures just intertwined for centuries. A place often called a beacon of knowledge during Europe's so-called Dark Ages. We're talking about this really fascinating period in history that left, well, an indelible mark on an entire continent. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled parts of the Iberian Peninsula, basically from the 8th right through to the 15th centuries. You've shared a stack of fascinating sources with us, everything from historical accounts to, really comprehensive encyclopedic entries. And our mission here is to distill the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from all this rich material. We'll explore its origins, its golden age, its eventual decline, and the surprising legacies it left behind.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating, I think, is how this period wasn't just one static thing. It was this dynamic series of states and cultural movements, very fluid. So we'll unpack the layers of its history, trying to show not just what happened, but also why it matters so profoundly for understanding, well, our world today. Get ready for some aha moments, I hope, that might just reshape how you view medieval Europe.
Okay, so let's set the scene then. Before Muslim rule, the Iberian Peninsula was dominated by the Visigothic kingdom. Our sources paint a pretty bleak picture of life there, especially for, the average person in certain religious groups. Can you help us understand what kind of society existed just before this really dramatic shift?
Absolutely. The Visigothic kingdom, its center was in Toledo. It was, well, characterized by extreme social stratification. You had the powerful Latin church deeply intertwined with state affairs. And this led to things like double taxation for peasants, who our sources describe as suffering abject poverty. It sounds pretty grim. And the Jewish population, they faced even harsher conditions. The sources state they were prohibited from owning land, couldn't openly practice their religion, and were even forced into slave labor and servitude. So, yeah, it seems like a society ripe for change, maybe even desperate for it.
Wow, that's quite a setup.
Yeah.
So given this backdrop, this internal strife and oppression in the Visigothic kingdom, what was the spark? What was the catalyst for the Muslim armies to even think about crossing into Iberia? What was driving them?
Well, the sources really highlight a stark contrast with neighboring North Africa. At that time, North Africa was apparently seething with vibrant energy under Muslim rule, and actually many of the serfs and Jews suffering under the Visigoths had already escaped and found a new home over there. The vision that was kind of propelling the Muslim armies, according to these texts, was one of establishing a world order wherein tyranny was abolished and freedom of religion guaranteed. This was deeply rooted in their belief in Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God. The aim was to create a God-centered civilization that was, well, at least in its stated ideals, meant to be more just and equitable.
And it sounds like they found a pretty opportune moment to act on that vision. In 711 CE, we have this general, Tariq ibn Ziyad, a deputy to Musa bin Nusayr, leading an army across the Straits of Gibraltar. What was their immediate goal? And how did this sort of initial foray turn into a full-blown conquest?
Right, so Tariq's forces, it was actually a relatively small army, maybe 10,000 Berber troops, and just 300 Arab troops they initially got involved in a Visigothic civil war. They were reportedly invited by a figure named Count Julian. Apparently, he was seeking revenge because the Visigothic king Roderick had, the source says, raped his daughter, Florinda, at court. So this very personal vendetta provided the strategic opening they needed. And a fascinating little detail here, the Straits of Gibraltar, named after Tariq himself. Jabal Tariq means the mountain of Tariq.
That's a great historical tidbit. I love that. So what happened once they were actually there? How did such a, relatively small force manage to defeat an entire kingdom?
Well, the decisive moment was the Battle of Guadalete. Tariq's forces, even though they were significantly outnumbered by King Roderick's army, were apparently superior in the art of mobile warfare. This was a sharp contrast to the Visigoths' more static, kind of traditional battle lines.
Yeah.
And after this key victory, Tariq famously burned the boats that had brought his forces across the straits.
Wow, really?
Yeah, a pretty dramatic move to basically ensure his men were fully committed, no turning back. This strategy, combined with the internal weaknesses and divisions within the Visigothic state, allowed them to conquer most of the kingdom within just 7 years. And they set up their capital in Cordoba.
That's incredibly fast.
Mm-hmm.
So after this rapid conquest, Al-Andalus, at its peak, covered most of the peninsula, even parts of southern France. But this early period, it sounds like it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, was it? What kind of challenges did they face as they tried to actually consolidate their rule?
No, you're right. The expansion definitely had its growing pains. We see raids into Aquitaine, for instance, that were repelled famously by Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers in 732. That's a big one in European history. But maybe more significantly internally, there was the Berber Revolt in the 740s. It started in North Africa, but quickly spread to Al-Andalus. This led to some serious internal strife and, kind of paradoxically, the arrival of Syrian Arab troops. Now, while these troops did help put down the revolt, they also introduced an element of what our sources call autonomous feudal anarchy.
Yeah.
The pockets of local rulers acting independently, not really answering to central authority, fragmented power.
Okay, that sounds like a recipe for instability, all right. What were the long-term consequences of all this early turmoil then?
Well, this period of disturbances and disorders seems to have had two really crucial lasting effects. Firstly, the Christian kingdom of Asturias up in the north was able to expand. It created the strategic buffer zone known as the Desert of the Duero. And secondly, perhaps most importantly for the future of Al-Andalus itself, the authority of the Damascus Caliphate, which had been the sort of overarching power, it just collapsed. This effectively cleared the way for local feared leaders to take control for a time. But it inadvertently set the stage for a really pivotal figure who was about to arrive and change everything.
Right, and that pivotal figure was Abd al-Rahman I, an exiled Umayyad prince fleeing the Abbasid slaughter back in Damascus. It sounds like his journey to actually establish rule in Spain was pretty epic.
Oh, it truly was. He lands in Spain in 755, and despite facing huge challenges, including the governor at the time, Yusuf al-Fihri, apparently trying to starve his army into defection, he manages to conquer Cordoba and declares himself emir in 756, independent ruler. Our sources even include this amazing quote, supposedly from the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur back in Baghdad. After Abd al-Rahman decisively beat back an Abbasid invasion force, al-Mansur apparently said, "Praise be to God who has put the sea between me and this devil."
Wow, that says a lot.
It really speaks volumes about Abd al-Rahman's determination and, how strong he was perceived to be, even by his enemies.
So he brings this much-needed stability. How did his successors then build on that foundation? How did they usher in what many people call the golden age of Al-Andalus?
Yeah, so under Abd al-Rahman I, the emirate finally gained some real stability. He famously started building the Great Mosque of Cordoba in 785, a hugely powerful symbolic act, establishing a lasting Islamic presence. His successors kept that momentum going. Abd al-Rahman II, often called the first great emir, he reorganized the bureaucracy, built more mosques, and crucially fostered an environment where science and art flourished. Kind of ironically, scholars were actually fleeing the Abbasid Caliphate at the time, seeking refuge and intellectual freedom in Al-Andalus.
That's incredible to think about, this flourishing intellectual environment. It reminds me of that story about the scholar Abbas ibn Firnas. Wasn't it during Abd al-Rahman II's reign that he supposedly made an attempt to fly?
Yes, that's the one. Accounts definitely vary on how successful he was.
Not bad.
But the mere fact that he attempted it really speaks to the inquisitive spirit of the time. It's quite something. And yeah, by 852, Al-Andalus had indeed grown to become one of the most powerful states in the Mediterranean.
In the absolute peak, the culmination of all this growth came under Abd al-Rahman III. He sounds like a real visionary, taking what was apparently a weakened state and just transforming it. What was his major political move?
Right. Abd al-Rahman III inherited a state that had been weakened by some internal struggles. But through a combination of force of arms and diplomacy, he managed to put down rebellions and really solidify his power. He even sacked Pamplona in the north. And then, inspired partly by the Fatimids in North Africa who had declared their own caliphate, he declared himself caliph in 929. This period, the Caliphate of Cordoba, is widely considered the true golden age of Al-Andaluses. It just marked an absolute peak in political power, cultural achievement, scientific discovery, the works.
Okay, let's try and paint a picture for you listening. What was Cordoba actually like during this golden age? We're talking about a city that apparently even rivaled Constantinople.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate its grandeur, really. Cordoba, under the Caliphate, grew to over 500,000 people. Eventually, it overtook Constantinople as the largest and most prosperous city in Europe. Just imagine that. It was this vibrant, bustling center for absolutely everything: arts, medicine, science, music, literature, philosophy. People came from abroad to study at the libraries and universities. It was a magnet for scholars. And the influence was so profound. Works that were translated later, like at the Toledo School of Translators, they acted as this powerful intellectual infusion that significantly affected the formation of the European Renaissance.
That's a truly powerful connection. Can you give us some specific examples? Examples of the scientific and cultural exchanges happening in Al-Andalus that had such a lasting impact elsewhere?
Certainly. This place was truly a conduit for cultural and scientific exchange. Take medicine, for example.
Yeah.
You have figures like Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi. He's considered probably the greatest physician in the entire history of Western Islam.
Yeah.
His main work, the Kitab al-Tasrif, it was this huge medical encyclopedia. It included groundbreaking illustrations of surgical instruments, detailed case studies, really advanced stuff.
Wow.
Then there was the Ibn Zuhr family. They produced 5 generations of medical experts. Imagine that lineage. Abu Marwan ibn Zuhr gave one of the earliest clinical descriptions of the scabies mite in his Kitab al-Taysir.
Okay.
In astronomy, you had scholars like al-Zarqali who accurately calculated the motion of the solar apogee, remarkably close to today's figures. And crucially, the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, our base 10 system, the numbers we use every day, it reached Europe via Al-Andalus. That changed mathematics forever.
And it wasn't just the sort of high sciences, right? Our sources also mention an Arab agricultural revolution. How did that transform the actual landscape and maybe daily life?
Yeah, absolutely. Beyond the sophisticated sciences, there was this very real Arab agricultural revolution. It was driven by significant innovations in irrigation. They brought techniques like the Acyclia surface channels and these amazing underground water channels, originally from the Persian world. They brought them to the peninsula.
Right.
And with that water management, they introduced a whole range of new crops that profoundly influenced Spanish cuisine and agriculture. Even today, things like sugarcane, rice, cotton, oranges, lemons, spinach, even the pomegranate, which is now the heraldic symbol of Granada. It was cultivated there, brought from Syria. It shows a profound impact on daily life, on the economy.
This sounds like a remarkably diverse and interconnected society. How did all these different groups, Muslims, Christians, Jews, how do they coexist and contribute to this vibrant culture?
It was definitely a complex tapestry, as the sources say. You had Muslims, who included Arabs, Berbers, and also Muladis. These were native Iberians who had converted to Islam, and they actually formed a majority by around 1100. Then you had Christians, known as Muzarabs. The name means something like would-be Arabs, because they adopted many Arab customs, language, dress, while keeping their Christian faith. And you also had a very significant Jewish community. Generally, non-Muslims were designated al-adima, or people under protection. They paid a special tax, the jizya, in exchange for religious freedom and protection by the state. Now, it wasn't always perfect harmony. Our sources do note challenging instances, like pogroms in Cordoba in 1011 and Granada in 1066. We have to acknowledge that. But particularly for Jews, during its more tolerant periods, Al-Andalus was often seen as a key center of Jewish life, and even an asylum for the oppressed Jews of other countries.
So we're talking about a real melting pot then. Languages, artistic expression. What really stands out to you about the cultural vibrancy of this period, especially maybe in language and the arts?
Oh, the linguistic landscape alone was incredibly rich. You had Arabic, of course, but also various local Romance dialects, which we call Mozarabic, plus Latin, Hebrew, and Berber languages all coexisting. Arabic became the main language of administration, literature, high culture. It was even adopted by many Christians and Jews for their own intellectual work. In poetry, you get these unique innovations like the muwasheh and the zahal. These were new verse forms that actually went on to influence troubadour poetry in Western Europe later.
Really?
Yeah, fascinating connection. And then there's the legendary figure of Ziryab. He was a musician who arrived in Cordoba in 822, originally from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. And he apparently just utterly transformed Andalusi culture, introduced etiquette of fine dining and sophisticated singing, new ways of cooking, makeup, fashion. Even supposedly the game of chess was a cultural explosion.
But even in this era of incredible flourishing, as you said, no society is simple. Our sources also point to some of the more, let's say, challenging or darker aspects of the period.
Yes, it's important to have that balanced picture. For instance, the widespread practice of slavery. The sources mention Christians and other non-Muslims were enslaved, often specifically mentioning white Christian Sakalaba who were trafficked from Northern or Eastern Europe. That was a reality. The sources also touch on a more hedonistic side, particularly maybe in the earlier periods. Apparently, Al-Andalus was relatively tolerant of homosexuality, with some prominent rulers openly keeping male harems or catamites. And homoerotic poetry was quite common in both Muslim and Sephardic Jewish traditions at the time. So yeah, it's crucial to remember that historical periods contain, well, multitudes, Good and bad, complex realities.
That's a really important nuance to include. Unfortunately, this golden age, with all its brilliance and its complexities, it didn't last forever. What ultimately led to the collapse of the Caliphate of Cordoba and the fragmentation of Al-Andalus.
Yeah, the Caliphate of Cordoba effectively started to collapse during a ruinous civil war that raged between 1009 and 1013. It led to its official abolition in 1031. It just fell apart. And this ushered in what's known as the Taifas period. Taifas means factions or parties. Al-Andalus basically fragmented into numerous independent mini-states, often led by local strongmen or governors who just declared independence. Our sources suggest that internal factors played a big role here, things like growing materialism and extravagance creeping in. Also, weak rulers and weakness in faith are mentioned as contributing to this disunity and materialism amongst the Muslims and the overall decentralization of power. It fractured from within.
Okay, so this fragmentation must have left them incredibly vulnerable, right? What external pressures were building up, and how did the Christian kingdoms to the north capitalize on this disunity?
Exactly. This fragmentation left the Taifas highly vulnerable. They were small, often fighting amongst themselves, and the expanding Christian kingdoms to the north saw their chance. A major turning point was when Alfonso VI of Castile escalated his attacks and actually annexed Toledo in 1085.
Toledo falling, that must have been huge.
Huge. A massive symbolic and strategic loss. It forced the remaining Taifa rulers to seek outside help. They were desperate. This led to the intervention of the Almoravids. They were a powerful Berber empire based in Marrakesh in modern Morocco. Their leader, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, came across, soundly defeated Alfonso VI at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086, and effectively brought most of Al-Andalus under Almoravid rule, temporarily halting that Christian advance, the Reconquista.
But the Almoravids' control wasn't permanent either, was it? There was another Berber dynasty, the Almohads, who eventually took over. How were they different, and what impact did they have on Al-Andalus?
No, you're right. The Almoravids were eventually overthrown by the Almohads. The Almohads were seen as more fundamentalist in their religious outlook. They believed the Almoravids had become too lax with religious issues and subjected to extravagance. They saw themselves as reformers, so they took control of Al-Andalus starting around 1146. And initially, they had significant military successes too, like Yaqub al-Mansur's big victory at the Battle of Alarcos in 1195.
And how did their rule affect the society, this more fundamentalist approach?
Well, the Almohads attempted to enforce a strict observance of Islamic laws. This period unfortunately saw many Jews and Christians emigrated because the conditions became much harsher, or they were faced with the choice of either death or conversion. It was a much less tolerant environment. This is actually when figures like the renowned Jewish philosopher Maimonides had to flee. He ended up in more tolerant Muslim lands like Egypt. Interestingly, though, our sources also note that the Almohads were responsible for founding public libraries. So a bit of a complex legacy there too, although sadly many of these were later destroyed in all the fighting.
So it sounds like maybe their strictness, or perhaps just the cycle of empires, contributed to their downfall as well. What was the critical turning point that really shifted the balance of power decisively back towards the Christian kingdoms?
The tide really began to turn dramatically in 1212. A grand coalition of Christian kings from Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, they united and defeated the Almohads at the absolutely pivotal Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa.
Las Navas de Tolosa, okay.
Yeah, this battle marked the decline of the Almohad dynasty. It shattered their military power in Iberia, and it led, again, to another wave of fragmented Taifa kingdoms, basically the remnants of Almohad rule breaking apart. But these smaller states were just picked off, one by the growing Christian powers. Cordoba, the once glorious capital, fell in 1236. Seville followed in 1248. The momentum of the Reconquista was now unstoppable.
So with most of the south falling back under Christian rule, just one last Muslim state remained, the Emirate of Granada down in the far south. How on earth did this final stronghold manage to survive for so long, surrounded by powerful Christian neighbors? It lasted for another 250 years, right?
It did, yeah. The Emirate of Granada, ruled by the Nasrid dynasty from 1238, was indeed the last Muslim stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula. And despite being essentially surrounded by Castilian lands, Granada was incredibly shrewd. For one thing, it was wealthy through being tightly integrated in Mediterranean trade networks. It controlled important ports, so it enjoyed considerable cultural and economic prosperity for much of its existence. The Nasrids were also masters of diplomacy. They survived by playing the Christian kingdoms of the north against each other, exploiting their rivalries, and they sought aid when needed from the Marinid dynasty in North Africa. Its location helped too. That favorable geographic location with the Sierra Nevada mountains as a natural barrier definitely prolonged Nasrid rule. Granada actually became one of the largest cities in Europe throughout the 15th century, partly because it took in so many Muslim refugees fleeing the Reconquista elsewhere.
And of course, when we think of Granada, we inevitably think of the Alhambra, that iconic palace.
Yeah.
It truly stands as a testament to the Andalusi culture, doesn't it? Even in its final phase.
Oh, absolutely. The Alhambra, the Nasrid's fortified palace complex, is perhaps the most visible and frankly breathtaking legacy of their rule and of Al-Andalus overall. It's just a marvel. It integrates buildings and gardens with the natural qualities of the site so beautifully. You see those exquisite tile mosaics, the intricately carved stucco, the geometric patterns, and those incredible stalactite-like ceilings, the muqarnas. It's a living symbol of the cultural heights that were reached in Al-Andalus, even as its political power was waning.
Sadly, though, even the Alhambra couldn't save Granada from the inevitable end, what ultimately led to its final fall in 1492.
Well, the political balance of power shifted decisively. The key event was the marriage of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon in 1469. By 1479, their kingdoms were effectively united, creating a much larger, more powerful Christian Spain. This meant Granada could no longer play the Christian kingdoms off against each other. That old strategy was gone. The Catholic monarchs, as Isabella and Ferdinand are known, were united in their intention to conquer Granada and complete the Reconquista. The final Granada War began in 1482, and on January 2nd, 1492, the last Nasrid ruler, Muhammad XII, often known in the West as Boabdil, formally surrendered the city of Granada. That was the end of Muslim rule in Iberia.
The fall of Granada, it marked not just a political shift, but brought truly devastating changes for the Muslim population that remained, didn't it? What were the human consequences of this final conquest?
Yeah, our sources detail a really grim aftermath. Of the estimated 500,000 Muslims living in Castile at the time, it's estimated 100,000 had died or been enslaved during the war and its immediate aftermath. Another 200,000 emigrated, mostly to North Africa, and about 200,000 remained. Now, initially, the terms of surrender, the capitulations of 1492, actually promised religious freedom to the remaining Muslims.
Well, they did.
Yes, but that promise was swiftly revoked. By 1499, forced conversions began, leading to revolts. And by 1502, forced conversion was decreed for all Muslims in Castile. This led eventually to the creation of the Morisco population, descendants of forcibly converted Muslims, and then their tragic final expulsions between 1609 and 1614. A real ethnic cleansing.
And beyond the immense human cost, there's also a profound loss of knowledge, right?
Absolutely. Our sources highlight this tragic loss. While some Muslim scholars were initially forced to share their expertise, particularly in things like irrigation or medicine, at the same time, vast numbers of original Arabic scripts and books were also destroyed, burned in public squares. And then you have the Spanish Inquisition, which had been initiated back in 1478. It became this instrument of severe religious intolerance, terrorizing all of Europe, as one source puts it. It subjected anyone suspected of heresy, including Moriscos suspected of secretly practicing Islam or conversos suspected of practicing Judaism, to investigation, torture, and often burning at the stake, a brutal period that further compounded this cultural destruction.
It's such a tragic end to centuries of, well, coexistence and flourishing. But despite this end, the legacy of Al-Andalus clearly continues to resonate, shaping Europe in really profound ways. What do you see as the most significant enduring impact from this whole civilization?
I think the most significant, without doubt, has to be its role as this crucial intellectual bridge. You had these monumental libraries in places like Cordoba, filled not just with translations of ancient Greek texts that had been lost to much of Europe, but also full of new, original works by brilliant Muslim scholars in philosophy, science, mathematics, medicine. When these works were eventually translated into Latin, particularly from the 12th century onwards by Christian scholars, often sponsored by monarchs like Alfonso X of Castile, that knowledge, combined with the interactions during the Crusades, helped launch the Renaissance in Europe. It wasn't just rediscovery. It was this active advancement and transmission of knowledge that directly fueled Europe's intellectual awakening. It really challenges that notion of a purely dark age before the Renaissance.
That's a powerful thought, that it was an active, dynamic contribution, not just kind of holding on to knowledge. Are there specific figures whose influence you feel continues to ripple through time even now?
Oh, absolutely. Think about figures like Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes. He's often called the father of rationalism. His detailed commentaries on Aristotle profoundly influenced European scholastic philosophy for centuries. Thomas Aquinas engaged deeply with his work.
Right.
Or Al-Zarawi, who we mentioned earlier, the father of surgery. His medical encyclopedia, the Tasrif, was used as a standard medical text in European universities for maybe 500 years. Their ideas, and those of many others, are still world-renowned to this day. It just shows how Al-Andalus served as this absolutely vital bridge between the Islamic Golden Age and the reawakening of Western Europe, a conduit for ideas and innovation that literally reshaped the continent.
And then, of course, there's the stunning architecture that people can still see today. The Great Mosque Cathedral of Córdoba, the Alhambra in Granada, the Giralda Tower in Seville. These aren't just beautiful structures. They're also a really tangible connection to that history, aren't they?
They certainly are. They represent some of the best preserved Islamic Golden Age architecture in the world. They are truly treasures. And what's also remarkable is that even after the Christian conquest, the artistic influence continued. You get the development of the Mudejar style. This is where Christian patrons actually employed Muslim craftsmen or used Islamic motifs and techniques. They created these beautiful hybrid works like the Alcázar of Seville, which was built for a Christian king but looks incredibly Islamic in parts. So this artistic fusion continued for centuries, long after the political change. It's a testament to the deep cultural impact that really transcended religious and political divides.
So wrapping this up, what does this whole story mean for us today? We've seen the incredible heights, the complex society, the eventual fall.
Well, I think while the external pressures on Al-Andalus, particularly from the Christian north, were obviously immense and ultimately decisive, our sources also suggest a kind of sobering internal reflection on why it ultimately fell. They point to things like preoccupation with extravagance, weak rulers, and weakness in faith that lead gradually to the loss of Islam on the Iberian Peninsula. Internal decay playing a role alongside external force, and yet the physical remnants, like the Alhambra, still bear witness to that profound history. It's amazing to think that the Nasrid motto, Wala ghaliba illa Allah, there is no conqueror but Allah, is emblazoned all over its walls, and it survived intact through centuries of wars, unrest, change, and earthquakes. It's just a powerful reminder, I think, of how complex historical narratives truly are, filled with irony and persistence.
This deep dive into Al-Andalus, it really does offer, I think, a shortcut to being much better informed about a truly remarkable civilization. What stands out most to you listening from this incredible story of rise, fall, and enduring legacy? Perhaps the most provocative thought for you to maybe mull over is how a culture's internal strength, or perhaps its internal divisions, its excesses, how that can be just as defining as any external pressures in shaping its ultimate fate. Something to think about. Well, that's it for this deep dive into Al-Andalus. We really hope you've gained some surprising facts and maybe a new perspective on what was a truly pivotal period in world history.
Yeah, and we definitely encourage you to continue your own exploration. There's always so much more to learn and more connections to make with this hill.
Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep being insanely curious.